quote an expert, quote, "We need to pass the bill to find out what's inside it," end quote. From the illustrious Nancy Pelosi. Now, what we're going to be seeing under this speech is that the affirmative team has no idea what's going to happen if you vote for their plan. And what we're going to be seeing is that even if you think that there's no disadvantage to their plan will not work, and they have to prove that. We're going to be looking at this through two voting issues, the wrong obligation and the burden of proof. Let's begin with the first, the wrong obligation. My first point under this is actually a conceded and dropped argument, which is that Taiwan concedes and claims responsibility. Taiwan concedes and claims responsibility. In the Constitution of Taiwan, they actually claim that all of this money is their debt. Why would a country agree to all that debt if it's not true? The only reason Taiwan would concede that debt if it is. Now, the affirmative team in their last speech, their only response is they read that on the text of the bond, it says these bonds belong to China. Now, I'd like to clarify for you. There are three different governments. There's China, the ROC, and PRC. China is the government that was before 1949 when the bonds were printed. At that time, it included China and Taiwan. That's what the government of China is. But then in 1949, after the bonds were issued, China broke up into the ROC and the PRC, the mainland China and Taiwan. So yes, those bonds say they belong to China, but they were talking about the government that existed before 1949. So yes, we agree with the affirmative team. The bonds say they belong to China, but at that time, what China meant is the Chinese government that included Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. Now, there's two governments that have grown out of China and Taiwan, and these are the ROC and the PRC. So the bonds, just because the bond says it belongs to China, that doesn't mean it belongs to the PRC, because China and the PRC are two different things. We use the word China to mean the PRC today, but back then China meant both countries. The impact of this is that they are targeting the wrong person, My partner talked about how they are holding the wrong person accountable, and they have not given you one piece of evidence saying the PRC is the one that we owe the money to. And I would ask them not to read any new evidence in their next speech. Now, they said that any successor is liable. My response is not when the previous government doesn't exist. Not when the previous government doesn't exist. When the previous government does not exist, the successor is not liable. This has been a dropped argument the entire round. Now let's move on to the second voting issue. Not only is the affirmative team targeting the wrong people, they do not fulfill the burden of proof. They do not fulfill the burden of proof in two ways. First, no specific advocacy. No specific advocacy. They can read you representatives saying we want the debt back, in which case we as the negative team are advocacies too. We want the debt back. But they have not given you any evidence stating that a debt resettlement with China will actually work. The only piece of evidence they said is that we will give these bondholders selectively discounted bonds, which is not what they're doing, and even if you agreed with what they're doing, that would actually harm bondholders. Selectively discount would harm bondholders. This was a dropped argument as well. Now, the second reason that they do not fulfill the burden of proof is that their solvency is unknown. Their solvency is unknown. Now, there's four critical dropped arguments here. Four critical dropped arguments. But before I get into those four critical dropped arguments, I'd like to remind you of the fact that they conceded that their entire case depends on the fact that China will agree. They say that we can't mandate China, but my response is, yes, you can't mandate China, but they still have to prove their case will happen. And they are putting themselves on an impossible standard since they have chosen to run this case. Now, the impact of this is that they have not given you one piece of evidence stating China will agree to a U.S. debt resettlement negotiation. Not one piece of evidence. They dropped my burden of proof press in my 2NC. But let's move on to the four dropped arguments. The first dropped argument is why mutual consent matters. All of their examples have been about mutual consent, and they dropped the fact that mutual consent matters. Second, they dropped the agency contradiction. England was using a different agency, so they can't claim that Argentina applies. Third, the amount of debt matters. With all of their examples, they've been unable to prove to you that the debt is the same amount with China, because when there's more debt, the government is less likely to pay. And fourth, they're not changing the credit rating. Even if you agree that the credit rating, it matters, there's no reason to believe they're changing the credit rating, because China is not paying the debt right now. And the credit rating drops when they don't pay their debt. Thus, in the current system, the credit rating is already down. Secondly, they have not read evidence saying why the credit rating matters. Now, they said that in Britain, they blocked investments. But there's a difference between exclusion to a financial system and a lower credit rating. There's a difference between exclusion to a financial system and a lower credit rating. In England, they were completely excluded from the financial system back when China was a small developing country. Under the Fermi-Tables plan, there's a chance that somehow the credit rating would drop, which they have not proven. In any case, we ask you to not side with the unknown, but stand with the known, which is the negative team stance in this debate.